I was born at the corner of Lexington Avenue and 78th Street in New York City on the fourth floor and in my mother's bed. We were in a brownstone. And my father was a physician who had a private practice, but he also worked as head of the medical department at Paramount. And Paramount then was that big building. It was still being built on between 42nd and 43rd, I think, on Broadway. It was Times Square. And it was a fantastic building. And it was eventually called the House That Shadows Built, because it was built by Paramount. And all the executive offices were in that building. And also the equivalent of Radio City Music Hall as a theater. It was a stunning theater. And because my father was medical director, I was always passed in. If I wanted to bring kids from school with me to the movies, we would go to the executive entrance, and the manager would take us in and sit us down. And in those days, you could stay there show after show, and nobody ever cleaned your, cleared you out. And because part of my youth was lived in the depth of the depression, people were fed outside to keep them in line. And there was food, donuts and coffee wheeled all the way around the block if there was a real headliner in the stage show. And the stage show was incredible. I mean, the movie experience then began when you walked into the forecourt before you even got to the box office. And if Tarzan was playing there, you had the jungle. You had to push your way through the vines in order to get into the theater. And there would be gentlemen hired from north of 125th Street who would be made up as cannibals, and they'd be working on the drums as hard as they could. There'd be false animals with lights and every theater, every first-run theater was in competition with every other one to see who had the best forecourt, who put on the best show before you got inside to see the show. And they were all elaborate, and no expense was ever looked at. And there'd be wonderful prizes. And the Paramount was famous for its organ, and all over the country now they're bringing back the Paramount theaters and bringing back all the machinery that used to be there, and the organs that could play not just music, but any sound effect, because it was all silent films when those theaters were built. And light displays on the ceiling. They could turn the ceiling into almost anything with the projectors that were everywhere with something else in them. And there was always a comedy short. There was another short which usually had Gladys Swarthout or somebody whose name is now forgotten, but new talent at Paramount or at MGM or Warner's or whatever it was. And they would use the opportunity to get that short as a screen test for the actor. They may show them before they signed them, and so they could be seen with an audience and what the reaction was. Then there was a big comedy, The Three Stooges, or there was a guy called Lou Lair, who he'd come on. He had a big fat face, and he'd go, "Monkeys are the craziest people," and all the comedy stars would be in that. And then there'd be sing-along, Follow the Bouncing Ball, and the whole audience would sing, "Daisy, Daisy, give me your promise true." And then ultimately the coming attractions, and then the stage show. And the stage show would start with a big fanfare, and the first thing up would be that organ, and that would rise from the depths of the floor, and there'd be a short organ concert, and then more things would rise up. And if later on it was Frank Sinatra appearing in that stage show, it meant, I think, 9 shows a day he had to do, because it opened at 9 in the morning and then went on through each program all day long and all night long practically. And so they would be lifted up, or whoever the headliner was, and they were always top talent. And the audience would get so excited when Frank Sinatra was there or Benny Goodman was playing. They would tear down the balcony rail. Once they did that and tore the whole thing loose and dropped it down on the people in the orchestra. And so my father, on the 12th floor at his little infirmary, was bandaging heads and doing everything else to try and cure the wounded.
Well, let me ask you this, Stewart. I want to get back to this experience in a minute, but I want you to go back and tell me, how did your father happen to be the
medical director?
The medical director for Paramount.
Family. His mother and father were from Europe, and his father, the whole family was, and all these studios were really family, whether it was the Warner Brothers or Uncle Adolph, who had so many members of his family.
It was your Uncle Adolph, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
And at Paramount, and they all were. And competing Jewish families, mm-hmm. for the most part, mm-hmm. and with competing palaces to live in. And my main connection with Uncle Adolph was he was proprietor of one of the most beautiful private estates in the country. And he had a world-class golf course, an 18-hole golf course.
And that was Adolf Zucker?
Adolf Zucker.
Zucker.
And it was 1,000 acres of golf course. There was a farm with 30 Guernsey cows. There was a pheasant house for the nights when people wanted to eat pheasants. There were indoor gardens for winter under glass. There were open gardens for vegetables. There was a sunken garden that was designed by some Italian architect with the most gorgeous lighting fixtures, swirls of molded lead or whatever it was, and fountains that sprayed in different patterns everywhere, very formal. And And then beyond the garden were the family gardens where the vegetables were grown and everything you could need to entertain sometimes as many as 30 guests on the weekend, with people who would come from the communities around who were related to the family or friends of relatives of the family. So it was a big community, and the children had their own house. There was a family house on this enormous lawn. Family house here, which had the Zuckers, the Adolf Zuckers, the Eugene Zuckers, who was Adolf's son and daughter-in-law, on this long hall. When you got into the house, there was a shaded terrace with rocking chairs, and Grandma Kaufman, who was the mother of mothers. She had my mother when she was 47,
Wow.
and my mother was the 10th child, and she was called the little tumor because Grandma was 47, and she had already put on the bonnet that women who were finished having children wore, and the family took her to the doctor because they were worried to death that she had a tumor that was going to wipe her out. And so she went in and saw the doctor and came out, and in those days they had stoves in the waiting room, and she pulled the little door off the stove and took off her bonnet and put it in. And, and that was the beginning of my mother.
How did you develop your interest in being a writer? Tell us that.
It came in through the back door. It came out of sheer loneliness. And I was always good. My compositions in school were good. But they always had to do with some great internal problem, even before I knew what they were. And they had to do with somebody who was saved, a boy who magic saved, or somebody came and saved. And
now, excuse me, let me go back for a second. What age were you when you were writing these compositions about personal things?
I still am. It's all I can do.
But when you started, how old were you?
I have a little pony. He is white and black, and every time I sit on him, I am upon his back. That was the first thing. The second thing was, oh, how glorious it would be if all the men who had hearts could see how cruel it is to slaughter beasts. We should eat eggs instead of meats. For oh, how the mother cow must sigh to know her calf is going to die. And I identified with calves because I had a very cold mother. And she was a daughter, the youngest daughter, the little tumor of Grandma Kaufman, who had Albert Kaufman, who was an executive at Paramount and ran the studios sometimes and was a producer sometimes, and was in the penny arcade that started Uncle Adolf on his business, on his career, where he had these machines and and he had the first wax gypsy in the world. There was one other in Switzerland, and he somehow, through Edison, learned about this one that was in Switzerland, and he went over there and he bought it, and it was you would have thought royalty had arrived because of the lines to put a penny in and see this woman reach for a fortune. people just were blown away by that. And he had many other features like Hale's Tours, which was a railroad car, and it could jump up and down on its tracks, and you paid 10 cents and went into this railroad car and sat down, and on the front of the car was a screen, and on the screen was projected all the films that Hale would take from the front of a train going from here to California, or as far as the trains went in those days, and also one that went up one of the Swiss Alps. And and my uncle, Albert Kaufman, his job was to jiggle this thing so people were, going like that and getting the full experience of being on the train. And out of that came the movies, and out of Uncle Adolph's friendship with Marcus Lowe, who started Lowe's, incorporated Lowe's Theaters, and he had met Uncle Adolph when Uncle Adolph was a furrier in Chicago after coming here from Europe. And Marcus Lowe had a sideline of furs, and he also was very big with vaudeville. He was interested in movies because it cleared the theater between vaudeville performances. But that was his interest, and then that became Lowe's Incorporated and MGM. So on both sides of the family, there was Lowe's and there was Paramount, Zucker and Marcus Lowe, and their progeny together, because they intermarried, gave me my mentor, who was years younger than me, but he was my first mentor in Hollywood. My first main one, the first one was Joe Fields. But
who was the one in Hollywood?
Arthur Lowe Jr. His father, Arthur Lowe Sr., had an equivalent estate, but Uncle Adolph's was homey. Arthur Lowe Sr.'s was on Long Island at Glen Cove, and it was very formal. It was in a palace, truly a palace, that had 40 rooms, 40 suites. It too had an organ that could play anything, anytime, and vast porches with 6 or 7 ping pong tables on them outside, all looking down through the most beautiful statuary on Long Island Sound and on his private pier, where he had a speedboat and a spare speedboat and a seaplane, in all of which he would fly or pilot himself to New York City, which was where Lowe's executives worked during the day, and Uncle Adolph would come by car or speedboat from the farm when he was not staying at the Savoy Plaza Hotel, where he was begged to stay when they were building that. It was a gorgeous hotel right near the plaza across the street. And they gave him permission to hire his own architect and to have them build whatever he wanted in the bowels of that gigantic hotel that was just in the process of growing up. And he designed a 3-story apartment, so you could get to it by getting off on any of the 3 floors that were together. And it was a house, a country house with 3 stories buried in the middle of the skyscrapers. You have the background now. You know what Glen Cove was at. Right. And that's what Arthur came from, but he also spent his summers on Mountain View Farm, Mountain View Farm, his other grandpa's place. Okay. And that's where I knew him, but he was a little baby. He was 3 years younger than I was. And while I was going to the cows every day and ignoring the tennis courts in order to cuddle up with the cows, and this is very relevant to my story, because I mean the story of me. I have cows in several of the movies that I've written,
Really?
just so I could play with them at lunchtime. And so that seed came from Mountain View Farm. And it came initially because I was taken to the cow barn in a carriage, and because I hadn't drunk my milk that morning, and the nanny wheeled me in, and there was a cow in its stall, and it turned to see me, and it had a whole stalk of corn with the cobs and everything, but the whole thing, and it turned its head fast, and it hit me, the end of the corn, and she said, "You see what happens if you don't drink your milk." So first it was fascination, fear and fascination, but then I saw a calf nursing on this cow. And my mother, who had wanted to be an actress and was allowed to be a silent actress at Paramount with John Barrymore and all these people, suddenly Grandma decided that it was not a good place for a girl as beautiful as my mother. So she demanded that Uncle Adolph fire my mother. And she was already established in smaller things on stage in New York, and Belasco, who was the greatest producer, had an appointment with her, to see about going into an important show. And on that day, Uncle Adolph called her into his office and said, "Frances, I hate to do this, but you're not going to be an actress anymore. You're going to be my secretary." And that wrecked my mother, who also by then realized that my father, who came from a very poor family, and just could not compete with the excitement and the lavishness of these other families, and they all would play bridge, and my dad would play for, a penny a point, while they would be playing for $10 a point, and it made him feel like 2 cents. So here's my dad, earnest, serious, well-educated, but inferior to all these other people, and a slave to the Zuckers, whom he took care of free, and the whole family. And he never got to see the third act of a play because there'd be a call in the theater saying he had to go and tend to Aunt Lottie, who had an imaginary cold. So that dynamic was what I came out of. And the escapes that came out of the two things that have run my life are my affection for cows, which I still have. I can't get over, and I always had a pet calf after we moved away from the farm. My dad would buy me a pet calf, and we'd make a barn out of a piano. A box of piano had been delivered in somewhere along a country road where we had rented a house in Connecticut for the summer. If we could find one that didn't have "No Jews" after the advertisement in the real estate section of the New York Times, or churches nearby and all the code words that they had. And if we make an exception and take somebody Jewish, we would be there. And Dad would plant a garden, and I'd have a pet calf. And there were many funny stories attached to those calves. But they were, to me, nourished. Their mother licked them. She loved them. She gave them the milk. And my biggest treat was to go, when I was old enough, and milking cows on the farms we went to go up afterwards and just milk strip, they called it, the last of the milk after the farmer left and took the pails away, into a paper cup. And I'd drink it while I was sitting there, cradled in the curve of the cow's neck. And that was till I was 18 years old. And I still want to get out. I see cows, count cows. Marilee wakes me if we're passing cows on our way here. And so that was a very, very important thing to me, that closeness with a larger animal, an animal that could protect me.
As opposed to your mother.
As opposed to my mother. And the other were the heroes that could protect me. And my life changed when my mother took me to see Peter Pan at the Civic Repertory Theater in New York with Eva Le Gallienne playing Peter, as nobody else ever has, and whose curtain call was, for the first time, she created it, was the audience flight, where she would come to take a very solemn solo bow, and she played it like a potential juvenile. I mean, she stole those children, after all, and kept the others there by one means or another, by making Neverland. And she took a solo bow, and with nobody else on the stage after everyone else had bowed. And then she just raised her arms, and suddenly she was airborne and all the way up to the back of the balcony, so she could touch the hands of all the kids who were reaching out. Peter, Peter, Peter. She back onto the stage. And how she was never killed, I don't know, because sometimes if the apparatus jolts or hits the wrong curve, she would go down so far that her legs could get cut off at the edge of the stage because she's speeding back. And so sometimes she'd have to hold her knees to save her own life. But Peter Pan and cows have been images that have kept me going as a writer. And my Peter Pan he was somebody you could look up to. Rebel Without a Cause is Peter Pan. And it's so close to Peter Pan in the scene where they're all lying around the pool, where they've escaped to this house, which actually was the house they used in Sunset Boulevard just before they tore it down. But I wrote that from my memories of the glass gardens at Arthur Lowe's, and with the glass turrets and every plant you could ever take out of any jungle there, and underneath it the projection rooms and the indoor tennis courts and the golf course and everything, all these rainy day things that were under there. But and you'd come around the corner and there would be a cave there with stalagmites and stalactites, and there'd be a figure in the mirror behind all this greenery, and your heart would jump, and then you'd realize that it was yourself. It was a reflection of you.
Stewart, this is amazing. So you're saying that when you were doing Rebel Without a Cause, the thing that was alive in you as a writer was the story of Peter Pan,
Yeah.
and all that represents, and that's also about nurturing and about a love for children. And
It was love given by a poor lost boy to somebody he could idolize, and to that person whose own need had to be hidden because so much was expected of his masculinity. And he had the courage to show the other side of himself. And the Plato character, Salminio, looked up to this boy for saving. And this boy looked up to the kid in the gang who challenged him to the knife fight. And my favorite scene that I ever wrote was when they were all gathered on that plateau to have the chicken run, and the two cars, Jimmy in one and this guy Buzz in the other. And before the race, and Buzz had challenged him to the knife fight earlier in the day, and they'd been warrior enemies during the day. But inside, Jimmy, in reality and in life, adored this man, an older boy, 6 months older, who was a hero figure to him because of his dashing and his willingness to be stabbed or to be able to stab. And so it was a constant context all that day, because Rebel Without a Cause takes place in one day, except for the prologue, because we wanted to have the urgency and the speed and the desperation and the significance of everything that happens in one day to a bunch of teenagers. And so that empty house that had housed Sunset Boulevard and became the secret meeting place of Plato and Jim when they were in trouble, and they both went there and found each other there, and Jim brought Judy along, and they make their beds right under the palms on the edge of the swimming pool. And in my mind was Arthur Lowe's place in Glen Cove. And the pattern is the same. You know, the Peter and Wendy go off, leaving the lost boys, who was Plato. And while they're out of sight, you know, where is Wendy? Where is Wendy? And finally Wendy comes in and they shoot her. But so they leave Plato, and they tuck him in, and they pet him, and you know they're his mother, and just as Peter and Wendy were the lost boy's mother, and then they go and do things that adults do, and here come the pirates, and it's Captain Hook who comes in, the head of the gang, and he's swinging his chain, and the kid has to fight him while he's defending himself in that empty pool, and finally gets out and slides under a piano and hides, and then that whole fracas begins, which ends with the death of Plato on the steps of the temple, because we use the planetarium like the Greek temple, and with a sacrifice made on its apron of this boy. And so Peter Pan was all over that. And mainly my things are about a young man in need who is sparring and who is trying to be as much a man as he can be, mainly borrowed from somebody else, a model. Part of what I learned to write was when my mother would have enough of me, I would either have left a pet alligator in the bathtub on a night when she was entertaining or something, and I would be punished by being sent to my room to think it over until I was sorry enough to come out. Well, I thought I was sorry enough, but I'd come out, go back. And so Fräulein, our German governess, who was there for my sickly sister, but really was raising me instead of a mother, I would slip notes under the door, and I still have all the notes that I'd slip under one page at a time. Fräulein, please let me out. Fräulein, if you let me out, I will be such a good boy. Fräulein, I just love you. Anyway, there'd be 10 pages, and finally she would have said, all right, and I'd have a picture of me as a cow waving flags, and that would be the last one that I'd shove. I show that to my class. And so each thing I do is, in a way, a rebirth of childhood, the mentor and the mentee. And the favorite scene I've ever written was in Rebel Without a Cause, when these two enemies meet on the bluff before the race over the cliff. And Buzz comes up to Jimmy, and they look at the cars together, and then he beckons him and says, and they go to the edge of the cliff and look down. And Jimmy says, boy, that's a long, long way down. And he's got a cigarette. And Buzz takes the cigarette out of Jim's mouth, puts it in his mouth, and takes a puff, and then hands it back to Jim. And he says, I like you, you know. And Jim says, then what are we doing this for? And Buzz says, you got to do something, don't you? And they part, but that little island of connection in the middle of all this pretense of being big and strong and knife fights and all of that, this is love. And it's the same kind of love that there is in war that produces songs like My Buddy. And that became a dominating almost rule. I almost don't know how to write anything that doesn't have an element of that in it. And if it doesn't have something that hooks me in my most private areas and makes me want to be carried again, or carry someone else again, or both, that need for connection with experiences that I feel cut off from, the door that didn't open, the ridicule at school about being sensitive or being an art major when, that was sissy stuff. And being in the Battle of the Bulge and finding a buddy who I would give my life for. and who I was ordered to leave when we were being attacked, because we were just facing the Siegfried Line, my untried division, who had been shoved there right from the United States along this so-called quiet front with the Siegfried Line and all its bunkers just above us and the snow everywhere, and having to be sent one by one to replace one by one the division that had been there on line for 2 months or something, or a month, and taking over these stinking, awful burrows with firing trenches that went out from them, and we're supposed to sleep on these mounds of mud inside, and mud and planks that you improvised a shelter with, and then standing in freezing water in that trench when the sound-powered telephone told you that the attack was coming, and the dependency that you had on your buddy and he on you. And we were all ordered, the non-coms who were head squad leaders were told we had to peel off during that third night there, one by one, and follow our captain's raincoat, because he had a light-colored raincoat, through the night, and we had to leave our assistant squad leader on line to cover our retreat. So I had to leave Jim and half my crew and go. And, this is 19,000 people were killed in that one battle. And to lie there in the snow and always looking back at the hill that was being overwhelmed by artillery, the hill where we had been and where I knew Jim was. And it just was awful. And then we were stacked like 3 guys side by side, lying on their backs, another 3 lying across them, another 3 lying across them, so that we all would have churns being exposed to the tree burst artillery, which had fuses, which when they hit a branch would shower all the shrapnel down. And the ones in the middle were safe, and they were also dry. And ones on the bottom were safe, but they were soaking wet with the freezing mud. And then every 15 minutes we would change. And I ended up on top, and I felt something right here, and I was sure that I'd been hit. But it was my buddy's foot. He had finally gotten out of there because they couldn't defend it anymore. And he was stumbling around in the dark, and by accident, he found me in the forest, and he thought I was a corpse, and I sat up, and then it was just, oh God, we'll never leave each other again. And we didn't. And I found that when I had made enough money to buy my own house for the first time, that I spent it on buying one for him, because he had gotten married and he had 3 children by then. And so I bought him the house he lived in before I bought mine. And you never get over it. I mean, I'm under treatment for PTSD still. And so I have to have something like these situations in what I write, or I can't write. and I get writer's block. That, I mean, I hadn't written a whole script in years, and but I've turned it into teaching, and in teaching people to go inside and find the truth of themselves, and the truth of themselves in relation to other people, and to tell the truth and not hide or being ashamed of anything. And so at the end of the 3-week intensive, which 5 of us teach our specialties, they're open, they're brave, they're willing to tell their secrets.
Where are you teaching them?
It's called the Film School, and it's
in Seattle?
Yeah, in Seattle. But I taught for 13 years at the University of Washington Extension and developed this. As I got more courageous, I was able to design exercises wherein it was safe for them. I won't allow a visitor unless the class raises everybody there is willing for a visitor to come in. We had 3 convicts in the last group, all accused of manslaughter, and one came to the end of his parole while we were in session, and he was the most curious of all. He was there. I'd always bring everything from my first handwritten notebook that I kept in my pocket, everything in my career, all the arguments and the affectionate patter between Paul and me, whether it's recorded or whether it's in my notebooks or on the backs of menus when we were talking about how to cast Rachel, and we were in each other's pockets for as long as he lived.
That was Paul Newman.
Yeah.
Tell us about your education.
Well, it began in a building on 64th Street at Central Park West in New York. It was a school which is still there, the Ethical Culture School, which was attached to the Ethical Culture Society, which is a kind of open religion that anybody can adopt. And it had an auditorium that both the society and the school used. And the school used it for plays and assemblies and chorus and a very important funeral or a very important visitor like Mrs. Roosevelt if she came. And she would do an assembly. And it was wonderful. It was 5 stories high, and you weren't supposed to run in the halls, but everybody did. And
were you a good student?
I was a good student, but they discovered very soon that I wanted to draw, and I wanted to draw cows, and I wanted to draw pastoral scenes and whatever we were learning. And so when I was in 6th grade, and it happened before with various other teachers, but one in particular in 6th grade, who was the most severe teacher. I've used her in Rachel. I used her as a model, and my teacher had a canary too, that everybody kept. We all had turns cleaning out the canary cage and flying the canary and bringing it back to its cage. And I used that in Rachel. And also Miss Purinton would, when luncheon time came, it was never lunch, it was luncheon, she was a big, busty, white-haired woman, couldn't hear well. and very severe looking and dark eyebrows, and terrified everybody except me. And so she would come back. When it was lunchtime, she would just stand in the middle of the classroom and say, "It's luncheon time." And that was the signal for the boys to go to the cloak closet and see who could get down her smock. She would always wear a smock to lunch. And she would just stand there like a statue until somebody showed up, and then she'd get into it and say, "Thank you," and lead us all into the hall and upstairs and teach us table manners. And she was wonderful. And then after lunch, we'd come down and she'd sit on the floor. Everyone would sit down, and we'd play jacks, where you throw the ball and have to pick up the jacks and everything. So she was all colors. She was wonderful.
And what did you think of your art?
That's the point. She asked me what I wanted to draw. And I said, I want to draw about my grandma settling in a sod house on the Dakota plains, because she was a pioneer, came from Hungary and wanted to know what America was. So she bought a covered wagon without her husband even knowing, by taking in laundry in Chicago. And they staked a claim. And it was by a slough, which meant there was always water. And the Indians would smell her strudel, where she would make strudel in the kitchen. And so that's when they would come. And she was a great midwife. So if a squaw was having trouble birthing, Grandma would help. And well, what are we talking about?
We're talking about what your teacher
Yes.
felt about this.
So Miss Purinton and several other teachers knew that I was absolutely transfixed by art. And so they would arrange for me to stay at the blackboard during other classes, as long as I kept up, as long as I was listening and able to run and sit down and do my quiz. But I was almost always at the blackboard, or with paper covering the back blackboard. And so in Miss Purinton's class, I did Grandma, and Grandpa, whom I never met, settling, and the cows and the covered wagons and the Indians and everything else. And one day in Vermont, I was staying, doing summer theater, appearing in Midsummer Night's Dream in Brandon, Vermont, where I had friends who were, one was a handyman, one was a guy who knew how to tap his own maple trees and who showed me how to gig frogs, and I'd show him how to cook them. And he'd make salad by going down into the marsh and pulling out little baby ferns and cattails, and then railed at his wife for coming home with a market bag from the, And so I was there, and it, once you're in Vermont, and she lived in Augusta, Maine, and I just was stopped in the middle of the pasture, and I said, I've got to see Miss Purinton. So I drove down to where she lived. I had seen her, I had visited her twice before, but I knew this was necessary right now. And so I drove there, and this shrunken little lady was sitting up high on a bench. You walked up some steps, and there was her house behind her. She was sitting there, and she gave me a look. We hadn't seen each other in years. And she said, come on, sit down. So I sat down. She said, it's funny, the Orioles are late this year. Usually one right in that tree. I wonder what happened to the Orioles. And what's happened to you? And I said, a lot. Met Joan Crawford yet? I said, no. Where that came from, I don't know. But gradually I could see through to Miss Purinton. Yeah. And she said, time's short. She said, I have something to show you. Come with me to my garage. She used to drive, and the dusty old car was in the garage. We both opened the door. We got in. She said, slide it shut. I slid it shut, and on the back of it, tacked, was my mural from Miss Purinton's class of Grandma Settling in the West. Wow. She said, I look at it every day, even now when I'm not driving. I close the door and I look at that. Wow. And she said, is there anything you'd like in my house? Let's walk through and you pick anything. And so we walked through, and I saw this square tile which had been glazed and fired, and it had ALP down in the corner. So it was Angie Lois Purinton. And it was just this single black letter that was raised from a neutral square against sort of top glazed, so black against taupe, whatever. And I said, I'd like to know what that word means. She said, is this the thing you want? I said, yeah, it is. Mm-hmm. What's the word? She said, I knew you'd gravitate to this. The word is truth.
Maybe this will tie into your college education, how your acting career came about.
My acting career came about. We always did a festival at school, so I had a chance to act at school. But then one summer, my parents would usually take a house in Connecticut, and I didn't want to do that. And I had come back from college. It was my freshman year.
Where were you at college?
University of Iowa. And I chose it for two reasons. One was that I wanted to be where I probably wouldn't be again. And I had gone to a primarily Jewish school in New York City and a progressive school. And I knew this would be a different experience. And I was scared to death, especially of the Jewish question. And especially when they pulled into the station at Iowa City, and our trunks we all had trunks in those days. And the baggage handlers that were putting them into the station house said, here's another one from New York. And that was my first introduction to that. And then we were given lists, because there was no room in the dormitory, of possible boarding houses. And they were approved, and you could rent a room, and they belonged to older women and old ladies, and wonderful old houses in Iowa City. And I went to one initially, and she had the door on the chain, and where are you from? And I said, I'm from New York. She said, Drew, I said, yes. She said, no, go to the next block. There's a woman there who's got something. She doesn't mind. So she was Mrs. McLaughlin, who sent me cookies all during World War II and let me eat one night a week with them at the table. And I had my own room and used a common bath with her and her asthmatic husband, who had a terrible problem with farting, very loud all night, and but a decent man. And so that's where I take my baths, and that's where I lived during the time I was, most of the time. And then I did get into the dorm, and that was a whole different life.
How was that? Did you run into anti-Semitism there?
No, I didn't. They talk about it sometimes, but they made exceptions. And then I would recruit them for parts. I switched to theater because that summer when I didn't want to go with my parents, I looked for a job in New York and I couldn't find one. And then I heard about, and the war had just begun, and I heard about, not with us in it, but with Britain. And I heard about this audition being held for an acting scholarship at East Hampton. And so I went and met the director of it, and he gave me something to read in his apartment, and I read it, and he said, well, why don't you prepare something and come to the auditions? He said, I have a theater in New York on Broadway that was closed because there was no play to go into it, and I have it for 2 days, and I'm selling tickets to anybody in the public who wants to come and watch the auditions, and all the money will go to Bundles for Britain, because we were buying food and sending it and everything. And so I went to see my teacher, who was the English teacher who directed the Christmas festivals, and she had seen me act a lot. I played the mock turtle in Alice in Wonderland to great acclaim. And I was in St. Joan and a lot of plays. And so she said, there's a passage in a play by George M. Cohan called Ah, Wilderness. There's a young boy, and I think you could try that. So I got it and studied it, and we all jammed into that theater, 150 people. And it was on the stage where, oh God, the wonderful play where the two old ladies are giving people, any lonely stranger, they give them some kind of wine that they make, and they die, and then they bury them in the cellar.
No.
And
Arsenic and Old Lace?
Arsenic and Old Lace. And so that was the stage, and that was the set. And so I was in the balcony with all these other people and people who had paid, and then I heard my name called. So I came down out of the balcony, and I went up on stage, announced my name. In the front row was the head of this school, who was a Bostonian who had one of those wonderful nasal ways of talking, and very, very well educated. And his name was Leighton Rawlins, and he had very well connected in Boston and everywhere. So next to him was Antoinette Perry, who was a great director and producer on Broadway, and after whom the Tonys are named. And she was a judge. And then next to her was Josephine Hull, who was the roly-poly actress in
Arsenic and Old Lace.
in the play that you just
Arsenic and
Arsenic and Old Lace. And next to her was Boris Karloff,
Wow.
who was in it. So those were the judges. And I got on, and I was shaking so hard. My knees were literally knocking. So I asked if I could have a chair. And it was supposed to be on a beach. And so they handed me a chair, and I sat in the chair. And they still wouldn't stop. It was like a tremor. So I asked if I could lie down. So they said, all right. So I did the whole thing lying this way on the stage and got through and barely made it back up to the balcony. And it was the second day this was going on. So they had to judge. And so Leighton said, we're now going to go in and have a conference. So sit on your suspense until we come back. So it was like this, and they hardly left. They just raised their asses off the chairs, and the heads were there. Yeah. And they said, the girl, the lucky girl, is Chloe Killypeach from London. And everybody burst into applause. And they said, the boy, and Karloff got up. Is there a Stewart Stern in the house? And I said, yeah, yes. Come down.
Wow.
So I came down, and I was given the boys' scholarship. There were two, actually.
Wow.
And so I staggered out onto Broadway, and Ethel Merman was just walking up the street to her show. And I fell into step behind Ethel Merman, and I said, it's our street now. she just turned around, and smiled.
So how did you make the transition to the career that you're most known for, which is writing? How did you make that transition?
Well, I had written very good compositions in school, and there was the head of the English department was a man named Elbert Lenrow, and he had a special section called English Seminar that very select students were invited to. And we went through a list of books, reading, and having to write essays about them that I could not find the equivalent when I finally got to college of what the reading we had done and the depth of it.
Wow.
And so I knew that, and he said the day I graduated and went to his office in tears because I was having to leave all my friends. And he said, don't worry, it'll pass in time. But it never did. And one of my classmates was Deanne Nemerov, who became Deanne Arbus. And she and I were classmates, and I was in love with her from the time I was 6 until I found out she was already engaged, which was still at Fieldston in high school.
Yeah.
But I used to sit on a bench across from where she lived in the San Remo on Central Park West at night, even in the snow, and just look up and imagine her in that apartment, and I'd see her shadow go by, and just then I would give her a painting or something. And but anyway, so there was acting was all part of that. And then when Arthur Lowe Jr., and this is where he comes back, because when we were at Glen Cove at the Palace, they always ran a movie at night and after dinner, and you get dressed up and go to the movie after the day's activities. if you were old enough, and I was old enough and he wasn't. And so and we were sharing a room. So he had gone to bed and I went to the movie and came out afterwards, and there were drinks and everything going on. And then I finally went up to our room and he watched me. He was in bed. I knew he wasn't asleep, but I wasn't supposed to talk to him after that. He was supposed to be asleep. And he sat up in bed and he said, "Stewart?" I said, "Yeah." He said, "When we're old enough, we're going to live together. And we're going to live in California. And you're going to live with me. And you're going to write at MGM. And I'm going to produce and write and direct and be an actor at MGM. Good night." And fade out, fade in, he arrived after World War II and said, "Well, where are we living?" And I hadn't seen him because he had been living in Arizona. He had asthma and doing stateside duty in the Army, breaking the records that all the stars made to send to the troops, and that had to be sent back and broken because they would bring a fortune on the open market, and they were just voluntary. So we moved into a place. Meanwhile, Joe Fields, who was there was a great vaudeville team called Weber and Fields with Yiddish comedy bounced off each other. And he was Joe Fields, who was the son of Lou Fields. Joe Fields' sister was Dorothy Fields, who was the lyricist who wrote The Way You Look Tonight and, almost all the Fred Astaire songs and musicals and everything else. And she became a close friend of my mother. And but Joe got me my first job on Broadway in a show that he and Jerry Charteroff had written called The French Touch, which was about occupied Paris and about this group of actors who decided to make their own play without saying anything, and to do it instead of the one they were scheduled for, because it was a play about revolution, about breaking loose and getting rid of the Nazis. And they knew they could all go to concentration camp for doing it, but it was their big statement. So he had me as understudy and as stage manager, assistant stage manager. And the night before the formal opening, and I had no time for understudy rehearsal, so I had never done the play. And I was at dinner at my parents' apartment, and the call came from the stage manager saying, "Get your ass down here, you're on tonight in the lead juvenile part." And I whizzed out of there with turnips at the back of my throat, which I didn't swallow for 6 hours, I think. And I had to get into his costume and put on a mustache, and Brian Ahern was in it, and all kinds of actors, and they were all whispering and moving me where I should move, and it was just insane. But I went on, and I found that when I heard the curtain go up, I just said, forget everything, this is where you live. And somehow or other, I got through every move, every line, everything. The director was René Clair, who was one of the most famous French directors that we've ever had. And he came up to me afterwards and said, if this show runs, you're going to play this part. You're not going to understudy it anymore.
Great.
And then there was a series of many other auditions. But when I got to California, Joe Fields called me, and he said, "What's happening? What, are you working at Paramount?" And I said, "No, I went there, I auditioned, but they didn't take it." He said, "Well, that's a damn shame. Anybody else in the family giving you any help?" And I said, "No, I've been invited to dinner and I've swum in their pools." He said, "Well, what's been happening?" I said, "Well, I'm going to a psychiatrist now." And he introduced me to a friend of his named Joe Mankiewicz. And he said, well, what happened there? I said, "Well, he's just been wonderful to me. He called me and asked me if I had an office to write in, and I said no. And so he said, come on up and work with me. Not with me, but I'm writing, and you can share my office and write." And I had written a play in New York just for myself, and I decided I'd turn it into a movie. But it never got very far.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I sort of began, and then Joe Fields made this offer, and he said, "You're going to be a dialogue director." He said, "You're going to be that because nobody can define what it is, and that way you can." So he said, "Just say yes, no matter what I say yes." And this was a little studio called Eagle Lion that was run by one of the seven little Foys, Bryony Foy, and Aubrey Skenk, who was a relative to the Nick and the other Skenk at MGM, was very in, and but very B, not an A studio. And they did movies sometimes in 8 days, but developed some wonderful directors, and chiefly John Alton, who was really the pioneer of art brut, not art brut. What is the term for it? It's that series of films that was made with almost no light, but very stark black.
Film noir?
Film noir.
Yeah.
And when one of the directors, pioneers of film noir, was one of our directors for these films that had to be made within. The longest one was T-Man, I think, and it was 20 days. But that was very long.
Well, did you write when you were at Eagle Lion?
No, I was a dialogue director.
Yeah.
I was teaching Turhan Bey his lines
Yeah.
in the morning, and Virginia Mayo, and all these people, some wonderful people. And
but you had written, when you were in Joseph Mankiewicz's office, you had written a screenplay that hadn't actually gotten made.
I had written a play in
New York, and a screenplay though.
And I wrote a screenplay.
Yeah, and that
was writing a screenplay from it.
And then you went. That's right. And then you went to be the dialogue person at Eagle Lion. Then what happened?
And at night I was working at the Actors Studio.
Mm-hmm.
I mean the Actors Lab, which later was set on fire because at their annual celebration, when the audience came for a big festival, Hedda Hopper saw black people dancing with white people, and she just screaming fit, how dare they do it, and do it in public where we could see it.
Wow.
And anyway, so the Actors Lab burned down very quickly after that. They were all members of the group theater, and it was the time of those investigations in Washington, and everybody there was, accused of being a communist. And so anyway, somebody burned it down. Arthur Lowe Sr. came from the East, where he had an office in Lowe's State Building. And he came out there as a senior executive just to see how things were going on at the studio.
Which studio?
MGM.
At MGM.
And I had been hired as a junior writer. And I had written a screenplay under the aegis of John Houseman, who had been working on Julius Caesar, or was about to do Caesar. And I had done all my research, and I had written a screenplay called Joey, which John really liked and planned to make. And he incorporated me into that whole group, the people who had been thrown out of Germany and who were great writers over there, and all the best of the left-wing writers, plus Charles Lawton, plus Charlie Chaplin, plus, and he'd call in the morning, Sunday morning. He said, "Stern?" I say, "Yes." "Are you out of your swinish sheets?" I say, "Well, I could be." "Get your ass down here. I'm at Malibu. Brunch." And, so I'd go down and meet all these incredible people. And
this is John Houseman.
John Houseman. And then he submitted my script to Dory Sherry and called almost immediately. "I'm coming up to the house." And he came up to the house. He said, "Well, what are you going to do?" I said, "Well, I don't know. What about our script? What about my script?" "No one's ready yet, and they're not going to." I said, "What do you mean?" He said, "You're out. You're through." And I said, "Why?" He said, "The orders from New York to get rid of the beginning writers." And so we were out. Arthur Lowe Sr. had done a film that I had never heard of. He had produced a previous one about people, refugees crossing the Alps, and it was a co-production with a Swiss production. And it was, I don't even remember the name of it. But he had then produced another film, or had a hand in producing another film. And it was a film that Zinnemann, whom I had never heard of,
Fred Zinnemann,
wanted very, very much to do. And when Arthur came to the coast, Arthur Sr., he asked if we wanted to see this film that was called The Search, and with Montgomery Clift. And I was dying to see it because I had followed Clift in the theater. We were 4 years apart. And when I used to use my $1.10 allowance every week for shining my father's shoes, it was enough to buy a matinee ticket on Broadway. So I went every Saturday. And in the course of it, I saw a play called Dame Nature, in which Monty Clift played a boy, a schoolboy, who fell in love with a girl, and all of a sudden she was pregnant. And I was blown away by this performance of a very young person and totally identified. And then I began seeing everything that Clift was doing, and he did several that had to do with World War II. And here was a director who had directed Clift in The Search. And here was Arthur Lowe Sr. arriving with the film and showing it just to Arthur and I and me. And I never have been as moved, had been at that time, by any film as much as by that. It was the most authentic, it was everything I loved. It was a young soldier who adopted this kid who couldn't speak anything, who had been in a concentration camp. So it fit right into every portion of my heart. And when the lights came up after the screening, I said to Arthur, I have to meet the director. And he said, well, he's working at the studio. He's doing a film called The Boy with the Green Hair with Dean Scott Stockwell. And I said, is there any way you could? He said, I'll try. And we were sharing a house. So a day or two went by, and Arthur came home at night, and I wasn't still at Egan Lion. I don't remember what I was doing. And I said, Arthur, did you talk to Zinnemann? He said, yes. He said, Zinnemann said he won't meet you. He said he is very, very flattered that you liked the film, but he doesn't know what to do when people come in to his office and there's no escape. And tell him how good he is. He can't stand it. So I said, oh, well, thanks for trying. So he said, okay. About 3 days later, I had a call from Zinnemann's office saying that he wanted to see me right away. So I had a box of wheat thins in the closet in the kitchen and a pound of butter. And I went through the box of wheat thins and all the butter, just standing there, terrified of going in and seeing Zinnemann, because now I didn't know what to say. So I went in, and I think we both were gulping on either side of the door. But the long and short of it is that I told him that I was sure that my life had been changed by seeing that film. I didn't know how, but I knew that I would never be the same. And he said, well, it's very interesting the way fate works. I have a question for you. And you say that you liked my film, and I appreciate it. And I have to tell you that I liked very much your story. I said, what story? He said, the short story, Where is a Boy? Which was another one about me on a farm. Mm-hmm. Arthur, my cousin, mm-hmm. when Fred said no, he didn't want to see me, he secretly went through my desk and he took out that short story and took it to Fred. And I hadn't known that until Fred told me. He said, I think that you are a poetic reporter, and I want to go to Israel while this fight is going on, because all the Arab countries had invaded. And I want to find a story there. And I would like, I have offered it to Norman Mailer to come with me. And he's going to let me know at the end of the week if he can. And he called me the end of the week and he said, Norman can't come. Can you be ready to travel, get a passport? And so a week later, I was on a plane with Zinnemann. And being flown via Rome in steps to Israel. And we were turned over immediately by the head of the PIO there, the
public information.
Public information, to attend every morning. There were only 2 hotels in Tel Aviv. And Fred and I were sharing a room because he was doing this out of his own pocket to take me and to do all that. And so we shared a room, and he was a very tight, muscular man, and you knew it was bad news if he came to you and put his arm around you. You knew, oh, Jesus, what did I do? And very thin-lipped, loved mountain climbing, admired macho, which I was not. And but we were in a very macho situation because you could get killed at any minute. And so we would go to the PIO in the morning for the press report, and every newspaper in the world had their desk there to find out what was happening. And so then during the course of it, Moshe would give us the high sign, something like that, which meant it's time for you to leave this conference, go out the back door and get into the UN Jeep that will be waiting for you. And while he's telling them that everything is fine on the southern front, that no, the Negev isn't playing a part in this at this point, and down to the Negev. And so, and then tripping over the bodies of Syrian invaders who had been given shoes and worn them for the first time in their lives and couldn't stand them, and threw the but these crystallized corpses everywhere, and stepping over them and being rushed behind rises of sand and things, so we weren't direct targets. And that kind of research went on. Fred and I would talk together to these people who were fighting, from children to teachers to kibbutzniks to soldiers. And I realized, and he told me, that the making of the search depended on him and Clift being together over there with the first rough draft that was done incomprehensibly. They couldn't even read it because it was such stilted English and all wrong. And they had gone everywhere where the real situation happened, where these children were brought in and provisioned for further placement. And most of them gathered in SS, places where the SS lived before, and they inherited these dormitories. But anyway, so that was the research for the search that he had done. And so I wanted to get that kind of a background from him. So he sent me out alone very often, not away from him, but he would be in one part of a kibbutz interviewing, 3 adults who had had this experience, and I would be somewhere else. And I had learned during the war that when you're with somebody under cover of darkness, like 2 outposts who were put out ahead of the line, that you want to talk, and you have to talk very confidentially, quiet. Mm-hmm. And that the darkness makes you unafraid of saying the most personal things. So I would put myself on the roster of people who were going to be on watch through the night. And we might be down underground where the kibbutzniks would have dug a duplicate of what was above, including a little room where their school was, so life could go on. And through series of mirrors that were tilted toward each other, they could get daylight down into these rabbit warrens. And they were all moved by a needle that was attached and lying on a pool of water. And as the water evaporated, this needle would move, and that would put stress on these lines. The things that people improvised and tilt the mirrors so the last of the light would be visible downstairs when they put the babies and the children to bed. And
what project was this? What did this lead to, though?
Nothing.
Oh, okay.
It led to my first writer's block, and it led to my first attempt at suicide. And but I'll
Okay.
whiz through that because it didn't matter. But it was my first time being out there talking to people I didn't know and going as deep as I possibly could into each of them. And so I would give my name to whoever was the senior, probably 18 years old, of all the soldiers, and anybody who really spoke good English. And so I would be awakened and sent out with him for his or her watch. And we'd be out beyond the barbed wire as scouts, placed in one place and there to sense what was going on and then report back, so there couldn't be a surprise attack. So that's the kind of thing I did. And then we came back, and Fred said, where do you want to write it? I said, I'd really not like to come to Hollywood to do it. I would love to go to this farm I know, an inn in Vermont, where my mother stayed and my father stayed and I stayed once. And that began a whole line of my life with these people there who are dear, dear friends and dying. And we liked them so much that we got a burial plot up in the middle of Vermont now.
You said you wanted to go there and write, and so what happened?
Yeah. So what happened was that I would be given this wonderful little house that was a bar during the night on the other side of a dirt road looking over a lake. And George Griffin would put the wood burning, all the fuel in and everything, and I would sit down and not be able to write a word. And that went on. All that would happen would be that I would almost faint from terror. And finally, nothing was happening, and Zinnemann was calling me from California asking how everything was going. And I had to tell him that I said I have ideas and I'm writing down, ideas. He said, you should be much further along than that. He said, you should be at least half through a treatment by now. And I couldn't. So he said, come back. So that was the first time on my first real assignment that I failed. And I tried then working in California at the apartment that Arthur and I had. And it just got so unbelievably unbearable that I actually did. I had a lasso, because Arthur had lived on a ranch in Tucson, near Tucson. And so I threw it over a beam and I put it around my neck, and I jumped off the end of the table, and the whole chandelier fell down, and there was a hole in the ceiling. And I just sat there laughing. I said, anything is better than death. So I got up, and then somehow or other I got myself through enough of a treatment that it was as if I had to sacrifice my whole self in order to deserve to write. And Zinnemann read it, and he said it was promising. As it turned out, they were writing. The guy who wrote Exodus was writing Exodus while I was writing mine.
The novel?
Yeah.
Leon Uris, yeah.
And my screen treatment is a love story, so much like Exodus when Exodus finally came out. But they wouldn't, and Dory Sherry said they didn't want to make it. So that was it. But during it, Monty Clift came to Israel, and because Fred had him with him on the search, and Monty had written most of that, and he was in Israel with me, and we got to be friends, sort of, but he liked to go off with the army separately, and but anyway, that didn't work. And then Arthur Lowe again, Sr., had another script written. He had an idea about when he would get in his car and go across one of the Queens bridges to get by car to his place at Glen Cove, Long Island, at the end of a working day. And he passed all these high tenements in Brooklyn on his way across Long Island. And then he saw all these cemeteries, and he thought, God, what would happen to a girl who came over as the bride of a soldier and came to a place like this, thinking all the streets would be paved with gold. Mm-hmm. So he developed with this same Swiss company the agreement to buy Alfred Hayes, who had written a book about the war in Italy called The Girl on the Via Flaminia. And he said that he hired him, and then he sent me the screenplay. I was visiting Dickie Moore on a farm in the South, and just for a week in the country, and this special delivery arrived, and I read the screenplay that he had, and I wrote about 200 questions and sent it back. And then he sent me a telegram and said that he had shown it to his Swiss counterpart, and they had shown it to MGM. And everybody agreed that I should be assigned to develop that into a film.
And what did that become?
Teresa.
That was Teresa.
And so that was a whole story in itself, where I had to take over the MGM office and do a talent search and meet everybody. I mean, I designed the whole advance of the American army from the boot of Italy all the way, because I was fighting in Germany, and this was a different kind of war. So I took a photographer and a translator, and the photographer was also the chauffeur, and I took an ad in the key cities all the way up, from Rome to Venice, and those were our goals at the end of every second day. And I would stop at churches and stop at hospitals